Hey guys, in this final video, I'd like us to apply some of the last minute optimizations and fixes to the application. So I have the application going on localhost port 38000. Let's get back to the editor and we're going to begin with the app component. So I already showed you a bit of a different form for exporting functions from a module. And if you've seen the video in my ES6 series, you should already know that it's possible to export default and anonymous function. So in this case, we don't need to have any app constant to hold the function itself. We can just return the function as is from the module. And we're going to do that with the default keyword. And I'm also going to remove the parentheses around properties because we only have one argument, the props object to the function. And that's why the parentheses are completely optional and we don't need to include them. So let's save the file. Let's see if the application still works. It runs just fine. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through every single file one by one. And we're going to see if we can find places where we can make positive changes. Okay, so let's next go to controls component. And one thing we can do already is to use the same format for exporting default functions without actually needing to create any constants and hold the function references. Let's save that. Now the next thing you can see here is that the paragraph and the button are sort of duplicated for each of the controls. So that's a good indication that we could create a separate component. Let's call it a control. It's going to be a function that accepts the props and returns some JSX. Let's return the same markup. That's going to be a paragraph with the button. And as you can see here, we need to accept the disabled property first of all. So let's just structure it from the props object. That's going to be passed to the control component. Then we also need to have the onClick handler. So I'm just, instead of having onPause toggle, I'm just going to call it onClick. So this onClick is the built-in method on the button. So every button in React or JSX has the special onClick property or event. And then we pass the onClick method that's going to fire whenever the button is clicked. And then lastly, you can see here that the list of classes is pretty much identical for both of the buttons. You can make the classes dynamic by passing the classes property, but because we're only going to use the control component inside of controls, it makes sense to just simply pass the color of the button, so it's either going to be danger or success. So I'm going to keep the same list of classes, except I'm going to change the string to an actual JSX expression. Let's also use single quotes. That's what I prefer to use. And then we're just going to remove the isDanger class. Okay, so these four classes are going to be the same regardless of the color of the button. But then the color itself is going to be passed as the property to the control. So I'm going to pass the color property. It's going to be part of the props object, and we're just simply going to append it to the string. So for instance, if you pass danger, the class is going to become isDanger, and the same for success. It's going to be isSuccess. And that's how the button is going to be styled. Next, let's also change the paused variable to disabled because that's the name of the property that we're going to pass. And this is what the component is going to look like. And then next, let's also remove these other paragraphs and instead have two controls. Okay, so we're going to have two control elements. Let's put the other one just below it. And then we obviously need to pass the disabled attribute. We also need to pass the color, right? And it's going to be a string. And then we need to pass the onClick handler, right? And for the onClick, it's going to be the same function, right? We receive it as the props to the controls component, onPause toggle. Then for the first one, we're going to have a color, and it's going to be danger, right? The first button is going to be isDanger. The second one is going to be success. Now for this disabled attribute, we already have the logic in place, so I'm just going to copy that. The first one needs to be disabled when paused is true. The second one would need to be disabled when paused is actually false, okay? And that's how this expression would become true, and then the button would be disabled. Now for the actual text, let's also do the following. So In React, if you wanted to pass some kind of text inside of the component and you wanted to render that text inside of the component, you could use the special children property, just like the key property when you are working with the list. So for example, in holidays modal, we're using the key property. We're not actually defining it ourselves. It's a property that's built into React. And the same goes for children property. So let's also accept that property in the props object. Let's destructure it. And then we're going to just pass the children property. And in this case, in the first control, we're going to pass the pause text. So this is going to be the text of the button. This text is going to be injected right over here for our children. And of course, this pause text that does not necessarily has to be a string or a text per se. It could also be some kind of JSX, or you could have some kind of a tree in there. You could also put HTML or JSX elements inside of it. But in this case, I'm just going to keep it as pause, just as a text. And for the second control, I'm going to do the exact same thing. So let's close it off, first of all. And of course, we could also pass the text as a property. So you could do something like this. You could do, let's say, text equals pause. And then we could also extract that text property, right? And then we could just simply display the text inside of the JSX expression for the button. But I'm just going to use the children property because it's a built-in property. But just keep in mind that you could also have your own property if you wish to. And then we're just going to have the resume text for the second button. And I think that's pretty much it. We can remove the two paragraphs that we used to have before, the duplicated paragraphs. And let's go back to the browser. And it seems to work fine. So let's just click on pause. That is supposed to pause the timer. When you click resume, it's going to resume the timer. So we preserve the same functionality as we had before. Let's move on to the date picker now. And the one thing we could also do here is we have a class-based component. In this case, we are exporting a default class that has a name. But in this scenario, the name of the class is completely optional. We could just export an anonymous class. So this class would not have any name. In this example, it would just be an anonymous class, which is just fine. It's going to work the exact same way. And let's also adjust the styling or indentation here just a little bit so it looks neater, like that. Okay, I think that looks a little bit better. I don't see if we could change anything else in here. So let's move on to holidays modal. In this scenario, we are already exporting a default anonymous function. The one thing that we could do in this case though is let's just copy this div over here. I'm going to show you a small trick. So instead of appending the class with a ternary expression, we could also use the backticks, which denotes the template string that's been added in ES6. So the one thing we can have here is, let's say the modal class is always going to be present on the string. But then the second part of the string is actually going to be conditional. So we're still going to have the ternary expression. It's just going to look a little bit different. So the ternary is if the active property is true, then we want to pass is active with a space, just like before. And then we have a colon. Otherwise, we don't want to pass anything, okay? So it's pretty much the same as before, but I think it might be a little bit more readable, and it's in fact one character or two characters shorter. So let's save that and let's check that it actually works. And as you can see here, we can open up the holidays modal and we can also close it. Everything works just as before. Let's close off all of the other files and let's move on to index.js. I'm going to remove the class name here. We're going to rely on an anonymous class. Next, in set state over here, we're accepting the previous state, but we only actually need the pause property on that state. So I'm just going to extract it using destructuring. So we're going to have the pause property, and then we have to remove the constant keyword because that property is already initialized. We're just going to reset it to the opposite of its value because we need to negate it. And back in the browser, if you click on pause, the timer is going to be paused, resume. It resumes, but I can see a bit of a defect or a bit of an issue that we can actually improve. So I'm going to show you again. Let's say we click on pause. Obviously that stops the timer, but observe the following. If you click on the resume button, there's a bit of a delay before the timer actually goes back to execution. In order to make the timer execute immediately, we can update the current date property on the state in the meantime, but we only want to do that if the pause property is not true. So if not paused, then we can also set the current date property to a new moment object. In this case, I'm going to create a constant that's going to be new, or actually let's call it next state. It's going to have the pause property, of course, because that's what we need to return from this function, the anonymous function that we pass over here. And then if this condition is true, so if we need to resume the timer, in this case, I'm just going to say next state, and let's set the current date to a new moment object, okay? And we're just simply going to return next state, okay? Let's save that. Let's go back to the browser. So now if you click on pause, that's going to stop the timer. But if you click on resume, that's going to resume the timer immediately. So we were calling the resume function, but that resume function was actually setting up the new interval. That interval was going to execute only after the 1 second delay, right? Because that's the value that we pass to the interval. But now because we update this state immediately, we set the new value on the current date property in the state. That value is going to be updated, and then after 1 second, the timer is actually going to start. So that's how that works. Lastly, if we go down over here, the one thing I'll do with the button here, the button that opens the holidays modal, is I'm gonna add is outlined class, just for the styling purposes. So if you go back, you can see that it's going to be outlined. And finally, let's also add a section. It's going to have a class name of section. Now let's just put a small paragraph here. So I'm going to have an I tag that's going to make the text indented. And let's just simply output the current date over here so that the user of our application knows against which current date the timer operates. So for instance, right now we are February 10th, Saturday, February 10th, and it's 10:45 a.m. So I want to output something like that over here in a paragraph just below the controls. So I'm going to need to have access to the current date, and we can call the format function on it, or the method. And of course, we're going to need to extract that value from the state. So let's get it just along with the next date. And the format function is going to accept a string. Now, if we go to the moment.js documentation, and if you go to the docs, let's also go to parse. Then here, string plus format, in that section, you can see that they have a couple of tables that explain how the formatting works. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the format for days. The quadruple D's here will denote full name of the day of the week. So for example, Monday or Sunday. That's the first thing that we're going to use. Then we're going to put a comma. Next, we're also going to have a month. So the quadruple M capitalized is going to denote the month. So for example, December, January, like that. So let's copy that. Let's paste it over here. Next, for the date, I'm actually going to use capital D-O. That's going to denote the day of the month with ordinal. So for example, first, second, third. That's the next format I'm going to use. So let's put it here. Let's also put a comma. And next I'm going to put the year. So for Y's, if you go back, they denote the year. So it's going to be 4 digits. And let's also have a time zone. So let's scroll down a little bit. The single Z is going to give us, for instance, -5. So I live in Montreal. -5 would be Eastern Standard Time, or EST. So let's just put it here in parentheses. Let's save that. Back in the application here, that's what it's going to look like. The one thing though is I'm also going to put UTC just in front of it. And the UTC is not actually a format of any sorts. It's just simply a string that's going to be present no matter what. Back in the application, that's what it's going to look like. You have your UTC and then the time zone. So in this case, -5. Now, if you go to display and format subsection, you're going to see that there's actually a bunch of localized formats. So we can have a localized format that looks something like this. So for instance, Thursday, September 4th, 1986, and then the date. So we could just simply use that format instead. we could pretty much replace everything that we had before. And it's not going to look the exact same way, but it's going to be pretty close to that, and it's just a shorter form. So at this point, it's pretty much up to you, but I think I'm going to stick to the previous one. So I'm going to revert back to whatever we had before, and I think it just looks a little bit neater. And of course, in this case, you could also include the time. So let's go back to the docs and let's see if we can find a section for time. So here's a section for weeks and weekdays. And we also have a section for time. So we can have hours, we can also have minutes and seconds. And we can also say whether it's AM or PM. So let's put hours, minutes, and let's also have a space. And then the last one is going to be AM or PM. And I'm just going to put a comma after the year, like so. Let's say that. And I think it looks pretty neat at this point. So finally, let's move on to the timer component. Now over here, you can already see a bit of duplication again. So this div is sort of like duplicated across the timer component 4 times. And the only thing that actually changes is the contents of that div. So for instance, the title as well as the heading. So I think this is a good place to actually create a separate component. So I'm going to create a component here. Let's call it timer item. We're going to receive the props and return JSX. And just to clarify, the timer item is basically the item that you see over here. So for instance, if you open up the DevTools, you can see that we have divs over here, and we have 4 of them, 1 for each segment of time, right? So for instance, days, we have also hours, minutes, and seconds. And that's going to be the timer item component that we're just going to create in a couple of seconds. So back in here, they all are going to have the same exact format. It's just going to be a couple of divs with the nested paragraphs. And let's say we're going to accept a count. So that's going to be a count of days, hours, minutes, or seconds. We're also going to accept a label, and we're going to output that label as an expression. So the properties over here would need to include, like I said, the count as well as the label. We're going to pass them down in there. And now we're going to have 4 of those elements. So let's have them like this. Let's duplicate it 4 times. Now all of them, of course, like I said, are going to need to include the count. It's going to be an expression. And lastly, the label. And the label is going to be a string, so we could just keep it as a string. The first one is going to be this one. Okay, so we're basically flooring down the number of days, and the string is going to be days. Okay, I'm gonna do the same thing for the rest of them. Let's just cut and paste. Be careful not to duplicate the curly braces. Okay, this one, same thing. Let's put it in there. Finally, for seconds, I'm just gonna cut it and paste. And then here we have hours. I think the next one is going to be minutes. And of course, as you might expect, without much surprise, the last one is going to be seconds. Now I'm just going to indent them a little bit. So let's put them on separate lines. Let's also fix the labels like so. I think that's gonna look a little bit better. Okay. And then I think we can just remove the markup down there. And if we save that, let's go back to the browser. There's no errors so far. And as you can see, the timer works just fine. Let's add a date. So let's say January 1st of 2020. So basically 2 years from now on, the timer works just fine. Okay. Now, of course, the timer item could be a component on its own, meaning that you could actually export it to a separate module. And that's actually a good thing. When you are working in a setup that uses Webpack, you shouldn't be afraid to use as many files or modules as you wish to, because that's actually going to make your app simpler to use and maintain. Because, for instance, let's say that this component needs to be changed at some point in the future. So let's say you want to complicate the markup, add more elements to it, and before you know, the file is just simply going to grow. So in this example, I think it does make sense to export timer item to a separate module or file. In fact, for that reason, I'm going to create a timer folder. Let's create index.js inside of it. Okay, and let's remove all of this markup from timer.js to index.js file over here, and let's just remove the timer file altogether. Let's delete it. What we do need to do here is we actually need to restart the server in order for the changes to be applied. So let's see if that works now. So it seems to work. Nothing changed really. The reason it works is that whenever you include the timer component, so for instance in index.js, we include the timer, well, it's going to look for the timer.js file. It's not going to be able to find it, but it's going to see the timer folder. And because we named the component index.js, it's actually going to look for that index first. It's going to find it and it's going to import it inside of the countdown component like this. And that's why this import actually works. And that's because we call the file index.js. And in here in timer, we can actually create another subfolder. Let's call it timer item. You could also call it timer.js, by the way, but I'm going to create a subfolder. This might be useful if, for instance, you might also have extra styles that are only pertinent to the timer item component. That's why it might be useful to have a separate folder for timer item. And then we're going to extract the timer item, put it to the timer item component, or module actually. We're going to need to import React from React, because we're using JSX here, and don't forget that this syntax is actually JavaScript. It's going to be converted to React.createElement calls because we're using Babel, and we can just simply export default this anonymous function over here. Let's save the file, and then finally we need to import timer item from timer item. Okay. Back in the browser, everything seems to work just fine. But now the timer item component has been extracted to a separate file. So if you need to make any changes whatsoever, the structure of the files and folders is now a bit more complicated, but it's actually easier for us to manage because everything is separated by concern. It makes sense to keep the timer item in a separate module because, well, this module is dedicated for a timer item and this one is dedicated for the timer itself. So the components are sort of like separated in different files. And in the long run, it's only going to benefit you because it's going to be easier to manage the files. And on that same note, we're going to do the same exact thing for control component. So the first thing I'll do is I'll create the controls folder for the controls. I'm going to create index.js file. And I'm going to extract, first of all this logic from controls to the index.js under the controls folder. Let's delete the controls file. Let's also create a folder called control. So the control is going to be a folder for the control component, but it's actually going to be index.js file. And what we want to do here is we want to extract the control. Here the control is going to be imported just as before. So we're going to import control from control. Now the reason I use index.js, like I said previously, is because I don't want to have this sort of import that has control/control. And this would actually work if we called the file instead of index.js control.js. But in order to avoid that duplication, I just simply call them index. That's how it's going to work. So in this case, we will have the control. Of course, just like before, we need to import React from React. There's not much we could do about that. We still need to import React. And finally, we're going to export default anonymous function like that. And back in here, we import the control with the import statement, and then we use the control inside of the markup over there. Next, we need to restart the server. So let's run npm start again. Okay. And as you expect, everything works fine like before. So I think this was a good refactor for the application. I think I'm going to stop here. So this was the last and final video for the React series. So just to give you an idea as to where the channel is going, we're going to explore the Material UI framework. We're going to look at Firebase. We're probably going to cover JSS and CSS module loading, things of that nature. Basically styling as far as React goes in the nearest future. And we're also going to build a lot of different applications. And besides that, of course, we're going to focus on JavaScript. There's going to be new videos about JavaScript. All that good stuff is coming. It's already on the way. So stay tuned. If you like the channel, make sure to subscribe. Leave your comments down below. If you do find something weird about the application or you have suggestions or any type of feedback, just make sure to leave it down below and let me know. And with that, I'm going to close off the series. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'm going to see you next time. Bye bye.